In the first week of May, 1945, the Second World War in Europe had 3 days left to run. And in those 3 days, in a castle on a hill in the Austrian Alps, that war produced the strangest battle it had ever seen. On one side, more than 100 soldiers of the Waffen-SS, with mortars, machine guns, and an 88mm gun. On the other, 14 American GIs, and 10 German soldiers of the Wehrmacht, standing on the same wall, firing in the same direction. Inside the castle, one American tank, a Waffen-SS officer helping to organize the defense, and the most explosive collection of prisoners in Europe, 2 French prime ministers, 2 French commanding generals, a Wimbledon champion, and the sister of Charles de Gaulle. Half of them were not on speaking terms. This is the true story of the Battle of Castle Itter, the only known battle of the Second World War in which Americans and Germans fought side by side. The castle is called Schloss Itter. It stands on a wooded rise above the Brixental Valley in Tyrol, and for most of its history it guarded nothing in particular. What you see today is largely a 19th-century rebuild, a romantic fantasy of towers and battlements, built for beauty, not for war. Which makes what happened here in 1945 even stranger. The fake fortress was about to face a real siege. Find it on the map. The village of Itter sits a few miles from the town of Wurgl, on the road between Innsbruck and the German border. By May 1945, American armor was pushing down these valleys from the north and west, and everything between the spearheads and the castle was a shrinking pocket of men with nothing left to lose. This quiet corner of the Alps was about to become one of the last active battlefields of the European war. In February 1943, the SS requisitioned the castle. On paper, it became an annex of Dachau concentration camp, 40 miles away. But this annex was unlike any other in the Reich. It was converted into what the Germans called a Sonderlager, a special prison, for prisoners considered too valuable to kill. Berlin's term for them was honor prisoners. A more honest word would have been hostages. The logic was cold and simple: as the war turned against Germany, famous captives might one day be bargaining chips. So the cells had beds and windows. There was a library. The food was decent. And to run the place, the SS sent a man from the real Dachau, Captain Sebastian Wimmer, a camp veteran with a brutal record. The velvet was thin. The handyman, the electrician, the cook, all of them were prisoners trucked in from Dachau itself. So who was worth keeping alive in a Tyrolean castle? Start here. Édouard Daladier, Prime Minister of France when the war began. The man who signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler in 1938, and led his country into war 1 year later. After the fall of France, the Vichy government put him on trial, and eventually his own countrymen handed him to the Germans. Down the corridor lived the man who replaced him. Paul Reynaud, Prime Minister in the spring of 1940, the man who spent 6 desperate weeks watching France collapse, begging Churchill for planes and Roosevelt for miracles. The two prime ministers blamed each other, publicly and bitterly, for the greatest catastrophe in French history. At Itter they shared a small dining room, and for long stretches refused to exchange a single word. The generals matched them, feud for feud. Maurice Gamelin, Supreme Commander of the French Army in 1940, the man whose master plan was outflanked and shattered in a single week. And Maxime Weygand, the man summoned to replace Gamelin when it was already too late, the man who told the government the battle was lost and advised asking for an armistice. Each general held the other partly responsible for the fall of France. At meals they sat as far apart as the table allowed. The castle held the entire quarrel of 1940 under one roof, every man convinced the disaster belonged to someone else. Around them, the SS had assembled the rest of a broken France. Jean Barotra, the bounding Basque, twice Wimbledon champion, one of the most famous athletes in Europe, first Vichy sports commissioner, then a prisoner when he tried to slip across the border and join the Allies. François de la Roque, leader of the French Right, who had ended up feeding intelligence to the British. And Léon Jouot, the country's most powerful trade union leader, La Roque's lifelong political enemy, now living 2 doors down. And one prisoner whose only crime was her family name, Marie-Agnes Caillaux, the elder sister of General Charles de Gaulle, held with her husband. Add Michel Clemenceau, son of the tiger who had led France through the First World War, add secretaries and companions who chose captivity over separation, and you have about a dozen VIPs and their loyal few. For 2 years they lived like this, safe, fed, and perfectly aware that hostages are only valuable until, one day, they are not. By late April 1945, the Reich was a carcass. Hitler was dead in Berlin. The American 7th Army was pouring into Bavaria and the Tyrol. And through the valley below the castle rolled the wreckage of a defeated army, Wehrmacht columns streaming east, hoping to surrender to the Americans rather than the Russians. Mixed among them, units of the Waffen-SS who had no intention of surrendering to anyone. For the prisoners, every radio bulletin was wonderful, and terrifying. Because everyone in the castle could do the arithmetic of the end. 1 order from Berlin. 1 nervous officer. 1 platoon of SS with an hour to spare. That was all it would take to turn 12 famous hostages into 12 inconvenient witnesses. And across the collapsing Reich in those very weeks, other special prisoners were being marched, moved, and, in some places, shot. On the 4th of May, the system simply ran away. Captain Wimmer, the commandant, vanished. By morning, the last of the SS guards had followed him. The prisoners of Schloss Itter woke to unlocked doors and empty guardrooms. They broke open the armory and handed out what they found: rifles, pistols, a few submachine guns. 2 former prime ministers, 2 elderly generals, a tennis champion, armed, unguarded, and entirely alone. Their freedom lasted about as long as it took to look down the road. The valley was crawling with retreating Waffen-SS, men who were executing German deserters at roadblocks, and hanging Austrian villagers who dared to fly white flags. The prisoners of Itter were free, in the middle of a 50-mile pocket of the most dangerous men in Europe. They needed an army. And they needed it before the SS remembered the castle full of hostages. In fact, they had already sent for one. The day before, the castle's handyman, Zvonimir Kakovic, a Croatian resistance man serving his sentence at Itter, had pedaled out of the gate on an errand for the commandant. In his clothes he carried a letter written in English. It said, in effect, "Whoever finds this, the castle of Itter holds French VIP prisoners. Come quickly." Kakovic gambled everything on distance. Instead of the nearest town, he rode west, toward Innsbruck, 40 miles away, through country thick with SS, and made it. On the edge of the city he found American infantry of the 409th Regiment, and his letter went up the chain that night. A rescue column actually set out. It was stopped, by German shellfire on the road, and by a map. Innsbruck belonged to one American division, and Itter to another. The first rescue died in paperwork and artillery. So on the morning of May 4th, the castle tried again. This time the messenger was the cook, Andreas Krobot, a Czech prisoner, who cycled out with a note tucked in his jacket, aimed the other way, at Wurgl, the small town 8 miles down the valley. Wurgl was still, on paper, German-held. What the cook could not know was that the officer who actually ran the town had quietly stopped taking orders from the Third Reich. His name was Joseph Gangl, Sepp, to his men. A major of the German Wehrmacht, a career artillery officer, decorated on the Western Front, a man who had done 5 years of everything the war could ask. By every regulation he should have been retreating east with the rest. Instead, in the last days of the war, Gangl made a decision that carried an automatic death sentence. He stayed, and put himself and his last handful of men at the service of the Austrian resistance, protecting the town of Wrgl from the SS. When the cook's note reached him, Gangl understood two things at once. The castle could not be held by politicians with rifles. And his 10 men were not enough. The nearest real force was American armor, rolling toward Kufstein. And so, at midday on May 4th, a Wehrmacht staff car drove out of Wrgl toward the American lines, flying the largest white flag its crew could improvise. Major Gangl was driving to surrender, and to ask the men he surrendered to for a favor. The Americans he found were tankers of the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, a spearhead that had cut across half of Germany in 9 months. At their head, a 27-year-old first lieutenant from Norwich, New York, named Jack Lee. A football star back home, in the field, a cigar-chewing hard case. Gangl, through the surreal etiquette of a white flag meeting, laid it out, a castle full of French VIPs. No guards. And the SS closing in. Lee listened, radioed up the chain, and got a version of yes. He set out with more, but the mountain road ate his column. A bridge with a weight limit and a route under fire turned back everything but a single tank. What finally climbed toward the castle that evening was this: 1 Sherman, Lee's own, named Besotten Jenny, 14 American soldiers, Major Gangl, and 10 Wehrmacht volunteers who, 72 hours earlier, had been the enemy. Picture the scene at the gate on the evening of May 4th. A single American tank crunches up the approach road of a medieval castle, followed by men in 2 different uniforms. The French VIPs came out expecting a division, and inspected 14 tired GIs, 1 tank, and a squad of Germans. They were not reassured. Lee posted his strange garrison anyway. He was now the officer commanding the most improbable unit of the Second World War. And the garrison was about to get stranger. From the village below came one more recruit, Captain Kurt Siegfried Schrader, a decorated officer of the Waffen-SS, recovering from wounds, who had come to know the prisoners during his convalescence. When the guards fled, the VIPs had asked Schrader for protection, and he had said yes. So the defense of Castle Itter now included American tankers, Wehrmacht infantry, armed French politicians, and an SS captain, preparing to fight the SS. Lee laid out his defense with what he had. Besotten Jenny at the gatehouse, her main gun covering the only approach road. Machine guns on the walls and in the towers. Americans and Germans mixed together at the strong points, sharing ammunition, watching each other work. The French were told to shelter in the cellars. Several of the old men refused outright, and kept their rifles. Stand on that wall for a moment, in the dark, and consider where history had arrived. Men in American olive drab and men in German field gray, 3 days from the end of the war, passing each other cigarettes and belts of ammunition, waiting, together, for the same enemy. Toward morning, from the woods below, the defenders began to hear it, engines idling. Voices. Movement between the trees. The SS had remembered the castle. They came at first light on May 5th. A probing attack first, riflemen slipping through the trees to test the walls, thrown back by fire from the battlements. Then the real thing, between 100 and 150 men of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, veterans, with machine guns, mortars, and, dragged onto high ground commanding the castle, an 88mm gun, the most feared weapon in the German arsenal. What did they want? The castle back. The traitors punished. And no living hostages to tell the story. Understand the odds on that wall. Roughly 40 defenders, tankers, Wehrmacht men, an SS captain, and politicians in their 60s and 70s, against a battle-hardened SS force with heavy weapons and all the approaches. The castle's romantic architecture was suddenly deadly serious. thick walls, a single approach road, towers with clean fields of fire. It was 1945 outside the walls. Inside, it might as well have been 1345. In the middle of the morning, the 88 found its mark. A shell slammed into besotten Jenny at the gatehouse and set her burning. The crewman on radio watch scrambled clear as she went up. This photograph shows another Sherman, hit by the same weapon that same spring. This is what an 88 did to 30 tons of American armor. In one flash, the defenders lost their biggest gun, and the radio inside her, their best link to the outside world. The morning collapsed into a siege. SS assault teams worked closer under covering fire. Ammunition on the walls ran out box by box, and the wounded were dragged inside one by one. And through the smoke moved the strangest figures of the day, the old men of France, a 72-year-old general carrying cartridges, former prime ministers at the windows with rifles they had sworn never to touch again. Whatever they thought of each other, they were, at last, on the same side. By early afternoon, Lee's men were counting rounds. The relief force being scraped together down the valley had to be told one thing, that the castle still held, that it was worth coming, and every line to the outside was cut or dead. Someone had to carry the message out on foot, through the SS cordon. The volunteer who stepped forward was 46 years old, and he had spent his whole life being faster than other people. Jean Barotra had won Wimbledon on his legs and his nerve. Now he proposed the sprint of his life, over the wall, through the SS lines, miles of open country to the American relief column. Lee thought it was suicide, and said so. Barotra went anyway, vaulted the parapet, dropped into the open, and ran, gunfire behind him, into the trees. He made it, past the patrols, out of the pocket, all the way to the advancing Americans. Then the champion of Wimbledon turned around, and came back as their guide. Inside the castle, it was down to minutes. The SS were massing for a final rush on the gate, the defenders were down to pistols, a few clips, and the ancient promise of thick walls. On the battlements, the Wehrmacht major from Wurgel was still moving from post to post, steadying his impossible garrison, an officer of a defeated army, fighting his last action against his own side, for prisoners of a country he had spent 5 years at war with. And then, at around 4 in the afternoon, the sound every besieged garrison in history has prayed for. Engines on the Valley Road. The relief force of the American 142nd Infantry, Barotra riding as guide, smashed through the roadblocks and rolled up to Schloss Itter. The assault collapsed in minutes. Around 100 SS soldiers surrendered on the spot. The strangest battle of the Second World War was over, 3 days before the war itself. The cost, by the arithmetic of that war, was almost miraculous: wounded on the walls, and 1 man dead. Joseph Gangl. A sniper's bullet had found him at the height of the fighting. Witnesses said he was pulling Paul Reynaud, the Prime Minister of France, out of the line of fire when he was hit. Read that again. The only defender to die at the Battle of Castle Itter was a German officer, killed protecting a French politician from the SS. 3 days later, Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe was over. The VIPs were driven out through the wreckage of the roadblocks and flown home. Paris met them as ghosts from another age. And here the story allows itself one bitter smile. General Vigan, rescued from the SS on Saturday, was arrested within days by his own government, to answer for 1940. Freed by his enemies, jailed by his countrymen. France had survived, the quarrel of 1940 had survived with it. Jack Lee was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and promoted to captain. For a week or two, the newspapers celebrated the young lieutenant who had held a castle with an army of enemies. Then the world moved on. Lee went home to Norwich, New York, ran a tavern on Main Street, and died in 1973, decades before the internet would make his battle one of the most retold stories of the war. Wehrmacht buried Sepp Gangl as a hero, and Austria still counts him among the martyrs of its resistance, a Wehrmacht major who died, in the war's last hours, on the right side of it. By the railway station in Wehrmacht today there is a street called Sepp Gangl Strasse. Kurt Siegfried Schrader, the SS captain who defended his own prisoners, served 2 years, a sentence cut short, the record says, in respect of what he did at Itter. Daladier and Reynaud went back to French politics, and back to blaming each other. Some quarrels survive even the SS. And the battle itself sank into the footnotes for 60 years, too strange for the official histories, until a military historian named Stephen Harding dug it out of the archives in a 2013 book, and the internet did the rest. Partly because the story sounds impossible. Mostly, I think, because of what it proves. In the final hours of the worst war in history, the lines that mattered were not the ones on the uniforms. So here is the question this castle leaves behind. Sepp Gangl had survived 5 years of war. On the 4th of May, 1945, he could have driven east with everyone else and lived to grow old. Instead he drove toward his enemies under a white flag, asked them for help, and died on a castle wall shielding a French politician he had met the day before. Would you have made that drive? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe, because every battle comes down to one moment. This channel exists to find it. The last salvo.